Hey everybody, so in today's lecture we're going to talk about some careers in adolescent development that you could go into after graduation. Of course, this is sort of just a basic idea of some of the things that you can do. This information was taken from the appendix in your textbook, and so if you want to read more about them, you can read throughout your textbook as well as read the appendix. But I think that, this kind of gives a pretty good overview. This is not something that you're being tested on for the exam for this chapter, or for this section, I should say. But I think this will be really helpful to you, just to kind of have this additional information. So I didn't assign this information in terms of testing. I just think this might be something that you might find interesting, especially if you're taking this class because it's a major requirement. So I've broken this up into three major categories. We have the education and research section type of career, clinical counseling, medical type of career, and then families and relationships. I only have one career in there, but of course you can see that there are other ones that fit into this kind of category. So we're going to start out with education and research. And so really, when we look at studying this period of development, what we find is that, college and university professors as well as researchers really tend to drive home this area. If you go to graduate school after getting your bachelor's degree, getting your master's degree, getting a PhD, or a similar sort of terminal degree in your field. This is, you're spending a lot of time learning about development. You're spending a lot of time learning about psychology and learning about adolescence in terms of the developmental period, as well as specific things within an adolescent themselves. And while you don't necessarily have to be a developmental researcher or go into psychology, there are definitely other fields that you can go in and study adolescents. This tends to be a pretty common field that you'll go into. And so as a college or university professor, you may spend a portion of your time teaching, and then another portion of your time doing research. As a researcher, you might work for the National Institute of Health, or NIH, or National Institute of Mental Health, or NIMH. Which is where you can get government funding to study the particular areas that you'd like to. And it can be, very fulfilling to work in this particular kind of institution. Of course, you can work as a secondary school teacher and work in the school systems, whether private or public. Of course, you need to be certified in order to work in the school systems. And you may work in high school, or you may be a special education teacher and work with adolescents who have special needs. So you might be, working with adolescents who have physical issues, where they might have deficits in terms of just being able to get around, and or you might be working with students who have psychological issues, or health issues. You might, be working with, you will definitely be working with adolescents who have intellectual deficits. So they would need, for example, a plan or an IEP in order to make sure that they receive the services that they are required to have, and accommodations that they would need in the classroom. And so, of course, your job would be to help manage that and make sure that those adolescents receive the care and the plan and access to those requirements for those adolescents to be able to learn properly. And so, this is a very fulfilling, for a lot of people, very fulfilling area. And you learn a lot about different diseases, different ailments, different deficits, different issues that adolescents may have, and then how to accommodate them so that they're getting the best education that they can get. We also see educational psychologists who go through, and they, of course, get a terminal degree in their area, meaning that they get the highest degree. Typically, we see, I think, with educational psychologists, just like university professors and researchers, although some researchers can stop at master's degrees. With educational psychologists, they're interested in learning about learning. They want to know how to maximize a person's learning and how to structure education so that it benefits everyone or benefits certain people, especially those who need particular kinds of help. And so, an educational psychologist may work with adolescents in a way that they're trying to maximize their best learning styles. And so they may work on things like designing curriculum so that adolescents can learn better. And if, for example, a lot of you are familiar with SOL testing and being able to meet certain requirements, an educational psychologist might design a curriculum where a student in adolescent, for example, can learn how to take the test properly and how to excel in that particular area. School psychologists work very closely with parents, teachers, counselors, and they may work at a district level in the school system. Again, these tend to have terminal degrees, and depending on the program that you're in, usually you have an internship. So you would go through, for example, get your PhD, go through, several years of schooling, do your classes, and then fulfill an internship in order to be able to practice at the school level. And so this is working with teachers, working with the students, working with the parents, working with the district, working with the schools to try to make sure that each of those students are getting the best education that they can get, and figuring out what kinds of needs students have, and evaluating students and making sure that they are assessed properly, as well as they have a properly designed plan so that they can maximize their learning and also maximize their best behavior in the classroom as well. Now, clinical counseling and medical area, we see, for example, clinical psychologists who they again get a terminal degree. Typically, they'll get a PhD, go through all their schooling, and then do a year internship. This is a clinical psychologist is very often what we tend to see doing, in a lot of cases, research in a clinical setting, seeing clients, counseling clients, but not it's a little bit different than an actual counselor, although sometimes we do see those terms used interchangeably. A clinical psychologist tends to work with particular disorders. And it's different. A clinical psychologist is different from a psychiatrist in that a clinical psychologist is going to graduate school and getting a PhD, whereas a psychiatrist is actually going to medical school and getting an MD, a medical degree. And so a psychiatrist is a medical doctor who has specialized in psychological disorders. And so if you ever see a test question that it usually asks, something like, what is the difference between a clinical psychologist and psychiatrist? And of course, the difference is, psychiatrists going to medical school and clinical psychologists going to graduate school. One has a PhD, one is an MD. But you might also hear people say, well, psychiatrists are the only ones who can prescribe medications. Clinical psychologists cannot. So, that tends to be a bit of a tricky question, though, because yes, psychiatrists can prescribe medication because they are a doctor. So they can actually write a script, write a prescription for a patient. For example, psychiatrists typically label their people that come in as patients because they are doctors, they are medical doctors. Whereas clinical psychologists tend to call their people clients because they come in and they're, the client is responsible for their own care, and they're an equal player in getting better. Whereas a psychiatrist, because they're more of a medical doctor, they tend to see what they refer to as patients. And so you might see a question, well, can clinical psychologists write prescriptions? And the answer for a long time was no. that only psychiatrists could write prescriptions. Well, it turns out that in a few states, they've actually changed the law so that some clinical psychologists in some states can actually write prescriptions. Now, this isn't everywhere. This is not everywhere. And, this is very limited, but it is possible for a clinical psychologist to be able to have a license to write prescriptions. Because in the past, and in the majority of the United States, a person who has a condition that needs close monitoring, for example, let's say have schizophrenia, or even bipolar disorder, or something that needs, a team of people to help with. What we might find is that a person might go to see a psychiatrist and a clinical psychologist. They may see the psychiatrist to help manage their medication, and they might see the clinical psychologist for more of counseling and managing their symptoms and disorder. A counseling psychologist is one that more helps with issues at hand, counsels them through problems and stress and anxiety, things like that. And you might actually see that a person has a complete team with a clinical psychologist, counseling psychologist, and a psychiatrist. And what we'll find is that many times these individuals work together as colleagues to treat different patients and clients. Counseling psychologists also see the people that come in as clients versus patients. When we're talking about working with adolescents, if you have an adolescent who has a major issue, for example, schizophrenia, or has major behavioral issues, then you might find that, working with these adolescents is a little tricky. As a psychiatrist, for example, we've found that prescribing some antidepressants have actually led to suicide ideation in adolescents. And so you have to know, if you're a psychiatrist and you primarily treat adolescents, then you have to be really up to date on the research, because not all medications are going to affect adolescents in the same way as they do adults. And the majority of our research on psychotic medications is really done on adults. And so we don't know sometimes what these medications will do to an adolescent. So as a psychiatrist who maybe has patients who are adolescents or primarily sees adolescents, you have to be very careful and very up to speed on the research in terms of what kinds of medications you can prescribe that are safe for an adolescent to use. Now, when we look at school counselors, for example, this is what we traditionally think of. The first thing we think of is working with adolescents other than a secondary school teacher. School counselor is going to, work with an adolescent to figure out their career, help them out. They may give them a personality test and have them figure out what kind of career works best for them, what kinds of classes they should take to be prepared for their future, whether it's college or it's a technical college or an apprenticeship, going straight into the workforce, going in the military. All these different things are very important to consider. And an adolescent usually, we do have the few who come in and they go, I want to do this and I only want to do this. And this is exactly what I'm going to do. And they know. But that's kind of far and few between. We typically have most adolescents who come in and they don't really know what they want to do with their life. And so a school counselor, of course, can help them figure out that path and help them work through that. Social workers are going to help in family situations in case of, for example, neglect. If there's an issue, if somebody was reported due to a poor environment, or if there's abuse or neglect or drugs in the house, a social worker, of course, will come in and assess the environment and work with the family and an adolescent to figure out what is the best environment for that adolescent. This is an incredible field. This is very taxing. A lot of people do get burnout as social workers because we tend to not have as many as we need, and they tend to have a very high caseload. And some of the things that social workers see is very traumatizing. That's sometimes the worst of the worst and really bad situations, which they have to sort of go in and assess, and that could be very troublesome. But of course, social workers are absolutely needed, and we need all the ranks. There's different sort of positions you can have within the social worker world that are all very, very helpful. We can also have drug counselors who work with adolescents. We know on this chapter specifically that we're focused on right now is very important to look at in terms of the risk factors that an adolescent might have that puts them at higher risk for using drugs. Things like, socioeconomic status, how much money their parents make, where they live, what other peers they hang around with, what other adolescents they're hanging out with, if they're hanging out with older adolescents, if they're if they're engaging potentially in risky behavior, how supervised are they? All of these things can be risk factors that can put them at higher risk for using drugs. And a drug counselor, of course, would work with an adolescent to help them overcome the addiction and figure out how to properly address that. And so we've learned, of course, looking at the brain, that a person using drugs as an adolescent, this is when the brain is not fully mature, and this is creating pathways that could set them up for problems in the future. If they use as an adolescent, it could make addiction harder to fight as an adult if they become addicted earlier on, because they are essentially paving those pathways very, very early. So that can be troublesome, and very important for drug counselors to be able to work with adolescents to get them to get the addiction under control so that they can set them up for a better future. And we also have health psychologists whose job is essentially to promote healthful behavior and to try to get people to eat well, quit smoking, all these different things. And as health psychologists might work with an adolescent. For example, let's say we have an adolescent who is extremely obese and has a lot of health issues. Health psychologists might work with an adolescent to get that under control, to get them eating healthy and living a lifestyle that is much healthier than what they're currently living. Not only just to change the behavior temporarily, but looking at the future and having them shape their behavior for the rest of their life. And so this is important for a health psychologist to work with adolescents to help, make sure that they aren't on drugs, or they don't try drugs, that they, maintain a good exercise and eat well, and engage in healthy behaviors, that they don't smoke or, use tobacco products, to try to get them to make sure that they are the healthiest they can be. Because of course, when you engage in these poor behaviors in an adolescent, it tends to set up again for a poor outcome as an adult, because that can be those can be habits that can be passed along for years to come. Now, the final one we're going to cover, I only have one in here, but there are some others to consider. Families and relationships. And so just looking at this field kind of overall in terms of families and relationships, sometimes the best way you can serve an adolescent is to treat their family, to treat their the relationships that are around them, their peer relationships. And so this can be done in a lot of different fields. This can be done indirectly as well as directly. A more direct approach is a marriage and family therapist. So there's been a lot of research to show that if a couple is married or together, and they have children, and they're constantly fighting, and they have a really poor environment, a very unhealthy environment, it's actually better for children a lot of times in adolescence if the parents actually split, and try to work things out sort of amicably, and split up, versus staying together and creating and keeping this very toxic environment. I know that in the past you hear a lot of people maybe saying it's better for people to just stick together and stay together just to have that environment. But the problem is that, of course, that toxic environment is very bad for children and adolescents. And so it's much better if that can open up and really a couple split up in order to save the children's relationships. Or we talk about, of course, marriage and family therapists do help bring families together, and they help mend marriages that are going down the wrong path, and create an environment that isn't toxic, and getting people to work together, not just the couple, not just the parents, but everyone involved, and making sure everyone understands their place in the family and tries to work together to make things work. And that shouldn't stop at the parents. That should go to every member of the family. Everyone has a role and everyone has a responsibility to the family. And so these therapists can certainly help their clients create a much safer and better environment for adolescents and children and the family in general. And so a lot of times you'll see cases where adolescents might work, they may work with a therapist. Their whole family might be working with a therapist, which, it might be the adolescent that starts out with an issue, but the whole family is going to benefit from this kind of therapy. Or it may be that an adolescent is, sort of this is a consequence of the family. We might see that, a school psychologist might suggest, for example, a therapist for the whole family because of behavioral issues that might be seen in school. So there, even though I've kind of split this up into all these different categories, so many of these individuals work together to make a better world and a better environment for adolescents. And so this is certainly not limited. It's not the only fields that you can go in where you're working with adolescents, but this is sort of a general sort of scope that you can think of if you go, oh man, I really love this area of development and I really want to, work with adolescents either directly or indirectly. Some of these fields might be the right thing for you. So if you have any questions, please put it on the question form, or you can send me an email. I'll be happy to answer them. And I figured that this is probably a nice kind of end to the whole semester to kind of look at what kinds of careers might be open to you if you really like this sort of stage of development. So good luck on your exam for this or quiz for this week, and let me know if you have any questions.